special treat for a speaker series event. It's special for a lot of different reasons, not just because of the firms and the schools they represent, but it's great for me too because they're people I know and I think very highly of, and I had the distinct privilege to be a shareholder and colleague of Hilarie Bass. But let me tell you a little bit about the two people you're going to hear from today. Hilarie has, and I just found this out, shame on me, I didn't know, has been appointed as co-president of Greenberg, Traurig, which many of you may know is one of the largest international law firms in the United States, and has previously completed an 8-year term as the national chair of the 600-member litigation department. Don't let that intimidate you. I think we had 1,700 lawyers when I was there. You're probably closer to 2,000. And serves on the firm's executive committee. During her more than 30-year career, she has successfully represented clients in commercial cases, in jury and non-jury trials involving hundreds of millions of dollars in controversy. She is currently lead counsel for the Homebuilder Group in the Chinese Drywall MDL case, having served as lead liaison counsel in prior MDL cases. She's currently an unopposed candidate for the president-elect of the American Bar Association. And we congratulate you, Hilarie, on that. In 2011, she completed her term as chair of the ABA Litigation Section, and Hilarie is widely recognized for her pro bono work on behalf of 2 foster children, which led to the elimination and holding of the unconstitutionality of the 20-year-old ban on gay adoption in the state of Florida. You know, there's an old phrase, you lead by doing, and when I was a not-so-young shareholder coming into the firm, you knew about Hilarie Bass before you arrived at the firm, and she leads, and she's a great person as a role model for folks of all diverse backgrounds at Greenberg Traurig, and we're delighted to have you here. Our other guest today is Patricia D. White, and she's the University of Miami Law School's 11th dean. Her decade of service as dean of Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, prior to joining the Miami Law School, elevated her to the national recognition as a leader in legal education and made her the strongest serving dean in the history of that college, as well as the first woman to serve as law dean in Arizona. The National Jurist magazine has named Dean White as one of the most influential people in the legal education community in 2015, 2014, and in 2013. She was one of the top women on the list. During her career, Dean White has worked in the areas of tax law, legal profession, torts, bioethics, philosophy of law, trust and estates, and is published in prominent law and bioethical journals. To all her endeavors, Dean White brings an impressive combination of practical experience, dedicated professionalism, and philosophical activity. We're very fortunate to have another dean of another law school with us, so we're so delighted that you're able to join us, and it's really a privilege to have you here as well. So they're going to have a conversation. They're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions, and we're very much delighted that you're able to do this with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are not going to do anything very formal. And what we thought we would do would be really to have a conversation and to look at what we think of as a dilemma of curiosity, a challenge for women, and engage you in the conversation. And I'm going to give you this, because you're probably better at it than I am. It's hard to know that I'm Michelle Stefano's dean and colleague, but she has all of the talent with with this sort of stuff. And so we thought we would each just say a little bit about when we started, and then we have a little graph to show you, and then really have a conversation. So since I'm the old person, I'm going to start by saying a little bit when I started. And you'll see on our graph that the 10 years of difference between, it's not even 10 years, the less than 10 years of difference between when we started law school represented a sea change in women's attending law school. I graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1974. When I graduated, I had never met a woman lawyer. And you look astounded. There was no woman on the faculty. There were no women adjuncts. There were no women moot court judges. The first woman on the faculty, I later joined the faculty, but the first woman on the faculty was my classmate, Chris Whitman. And so that was a pretty extraordinary thing. So the first woman that I met was a woman who was, I went to Stefan Johnson in DC, and she was, there had very few women lawyers at that point, but that was the first group of women that I met. Now, we also had sort of nationally no real obvious exemplars in being famous women lawyers. Sandra Day O'Connor, after whom I named Arizona State, later didn't get appointed to the court until I think it was 81, something like that. And so all of that period, there weren't famous women lawyers. And then I'm just going to tell one other little story that also tells a difference, because as we reflect and we see where we are now, you'll see the changes. I practiced law in DC for a few years. I was a tax lawyer, and then I went into teaching at Georgetown. And the first year that I was at Georgetown, I had been a tax lawyer at Kaplan and Drysdale, and I went to Georgetown as a visiting professor on what was called the look-see visit. And at the end of the year, I was being unanimously recommended to be on the faculty by the hiring committee. And they were going to have their vote the next day. And I had been offered a job at George Washington University, and it was called an exploding offer. And the offer was going to explode the day before the Georgetown vote. That was nice. And so I was going to have to go into this, either just say, okay, turn down the one job and assume that the fact that I had a unanimous committee recommendation was going to yield the other job. And I was all going to do that. And I was sitting in my office 5 o'clock, 5:30 one night, that night, the night before the vote, and after I had decided I was going to say no to GW, when the head tax professor came to my office. He came in and closed the door. And he said, "I've come to tell you to take the GW offer." And he said, "It's too bad you teach tax, because to teach tax you have to be aggressive. And women just can't teach tax because if they look aggressive, it's unbecoming." And he said, "It's too bad you don't just teach family law," something like that. "So," he says, "I've come to tell you to take the GW offer." And he leaves. Now, somebody saying that in this day and age, just think of lawsuits and think you just can't do that. But that's what he did. So these words were emblazoned in my mind, and as soon as he left, I wrote everything down just so that I would have this record. And I called the chair of the hiring committee, and I said, "I just wanted to tell you that he's clearly going to be trying to oppose this, and tell you that this is going to happen." Unfortunately, he did oppose it, and he was the head tax person, but I was hired, and I joined the faculty. So I just tell you those two things because one, it was unusual to be a woman who was doing law, and two, and that's because there were very few law students. In my class of 400 at Michigan, there were 17 women, 7 of whom had graduated in the top 10. And that was the very beginning of the change. So now I'll let Hilarie start and tell her story of how she started.
So I couldn't have a more different experience, and it was less than 10 years later. When I started law school, 45% of my class was women. I assumed everything was a complete meritocracy. I happened to end up doing very well in law school. I had my choice of offers. Gender was not even a consideration in my decision as to what firm to go to. I did decide that I didn't want to go to a firm where I was likely to be the first woman partner or the first of anything, that I wanted to be in an environment where the law firm had always been diverse. I thought that was going to make my life much more pleasant. And that's how I ended up going to Greenberg as a summer associate. It's the only law firm I've ever worked in. But it was just taken for granted that it was a meritocracy and that I was expected to work as hard as everybody else and perform as hard as everybody else, and I would be evaluated purely on the merits. Now, I picked litigation. There were, in fact, fewer women in litigation at that point than trust and estates, which was, when I came out of law school, the place that was sort of women's basement, and that's where they put people who didn't know what else to do with. But even on the way up to partnership, I knew I was one of the best lawyers among the associates, and I had worked as hard as anybody else, and no question that I was going to be successful there. What I found, and I believe still exists, is that as you go higher up the chain, there are fewer and fewer women. And so the question that I think we still have to focus on is, why is that? Why is it that only 18% of equity partners in big law are women? The assumption when I got out of law school was when we were 45 to 50% of law school classes, it was just a question of time. At some point, by the time I was there, 45% of the partnership should be women. In fact, that's not the case. The most recent statistic I saw, in fact, I'll show you this. This is 2015. I've seen some more recent statistics that increase the numbers slightly, but you'll see this shows non-equity partner at about 28%, equity partners at 18%. So something is happening between those figures from when people are entering law school and when they're getting to the higher levels of the firm. So I think the challenge for the profession is what's happening to those women. I think the first thing that we all notice is that women leave the profession in a higher number than men. If you ask my male partners, they'll tell you it's a balance issue, which offends me terribly. We have part-time employment, we have part-time partners, we've made partners some women on maternity leave, we have very liberal maternity policies. I do not believe, for the most part, that's why women leave the profession. Now, there are some that do. There are some people who say, I really want a third kid. I don't see how I can be in big law and do that. And some people make a personal lifestyle choice. Look, big law is not easy. It's intense. It's a lot of hours, client demands. To me, that's what I love about it. It's so exciting. There's always new challenges. There's always some exciting legal problem that someone is handing me and say, fix this for me. I mean, that's why I wake up in the morning. It's great. I love it. I can't get enough of it. But I recognize that it's not for everybody, and that's okay. I mean, we can't make it okay for everybody. To me, the issue is, how do we ensure that women who want to stay in big law have the opportunity to reach the highest levels of the profession? And my impression is that one of the reasons women do choose to leave is because they don't see a clear path to success. Women like us who've had great academic careers, have had their choices of law school, have had their choice of legal careers, are accustomed to being able to set out a path for themselves and to know that if they work hard and they touch these 10 boxes, they're going to be successful. And I find there are women who choose to leave the profession because they don't see how they're going to navigate from being a partner to being the biggest rainmaker. I'd suggest that generating business is probably the biggest concern that most women have, because there are certain personality traits that do not come naturally to women. One of them is talking about ourselves. All the studies show that men from a very young age, they want to be the superstar basketball player. They want to be the leader in the room. And that women are much more socialized to want to be in a group and be friends with everybody. And when it comes to being a rainmaker, it takes a lot of talking to other people comfortably about how talented you are. Many women have issues doing that. At the anecdote I always use is that two young associates are getting coffee. They've both been with the senior partner at a hearing that morning, and the male associate is saying, wow, it was great, we killed it, and the woman associate is saying to her friends, what is he talking about? Neither one of us opened our mouths. We basically prepared it and handed it to the senior partner. He did all the talking. I would no sooner take credit for that, but that is just an example that women typically have a tougher time taking credit and communicating why they should get credit for whatever their achievements are. And when it comes to going to a stranger and saying, I want to do your legal work, I'm the best person that you could possibly hire to do your legal work, that is something that often brings a higher discomfort level to women than men. Now, I don't know, in academia, do you perceive that restriction, or is it purely based more on the merits?
So, go back to the slide that showed the law school enrollment. So, notice that from here to here was this incredible increase. And so this is 1971, 72, so this is mid right here. And then it's way up here, and Hilarie, you graduated in 81, so she's up here. That's an incredible upward, that's it. I mean, that's where it really happened during that very big period. And so when you look at that, you then think that just about now is where you would be getting a lot of equalization in people in leadership roles, because you see a situation where now people are kind of in the heart of their careers, who are Hilarie's age and around, because that's where it all happened. And so then you start to look at the different aspects of the profession and you see, well, what has happened? And so what you see here is the bleakest with respect to equity partners in big law. Why is that not happening? It takes a while for the equality of admission to the profession to play itself out in leadership roles, because the leadership people are typically older, and if it was all made up of males at one point, then they have to die or retire, and then doesn't happen fast enough. I mean, so there's that's happening. But you would think now that you'd be entering in roughly equal numbers, and then going up in roughly equal numbers. The big law story is clearly not happening. Now, if you go to the academic world, you'll see that it's better. Right now, at the entry level of faculties in the non-tenure track area for women in the academic world, in the legal academic world, it's, 45%, something like that. It's really kind of mirrors the graduating classes pretty well. At the tenure level, it's significantly lower than that, but it's significantly lower, you think, well, in part because male professors stay on forever. It's a good gig, so they never retire. And as a dean, I'm always trying to get them to retire, so this is a big problem. But in any event, so they're staying on, and the young women are getting older and getting tenure. And you don't see a terrible drop-off at the rate of people getting tenure as women at that level. In the leadership role, at the role of becoming a dean, when I became a dean, I was the 17th woman dean in the United States. And now there are 28%, I think it is, of the law school deans are women, and I think they're 58 or something like that. It changes on a daily basis because people don't stay in the job very long. But it's really gone up, much more the way you would expect that the graph would indicate that it has gone up. So there is a difference between the success of women in the academic world, still not what I'd like it to be, but in the big law world. Then there's this other group, and I'm going to let Hilarie talk about them, which is the corporate counsel world, which is another explanation, another sort of statistic, which is much higher than in the big law. So say something about that.
I think the percentage is somewhere close to 30% of GCs in Fortune 500 companies are women. Some would say that it's an easy way to diversify the C-suite because there are women lawyers out there and you can find one a lot easier than finding a superstar in business. That's one interpretation. I look at it from my perspective on the private law firm side, and I see that as being one of the things that is going to significantly alter the cap on our numbers. Because the reality is that when there are more women who are in charge of giving out business, they are more demanding, if not that a woman be the team leader, but at least that the team be diverse. I don't have a major Fortune 500 client that does not require us to provide diversity numbers now. And it's not a question of what are your firm numbers. They want to know what the numbers are for the team. Who is going to represent us? When Walmart goes to its shareholders, it needs to say, in these litigation matters, these are the people, these are the lawyers who represented us. And that is in fact putting huge amounts of pressure on private law to expand the diversity. And it's, again, not just a question of how many diverse associates you have. It's a question of how many team leaders, how many practice group leaders, how many members of your executive committee. And that corporate pressure is changing the dynamic in big law. It's not the only thing that's causing it to change, but it is having a significant effect. So for example, most work is now given out by big corporations through RFP processes, or what we call beauty contests, where they parade 3 or 4 law firms and you have to pitch why they should hire you and how you're going to be able to work efficiently and provide value to the client. There's an assumption that everybody is a quality lawyer, so you better be providing some added value to be considered. You don't show up anywhere anymore with 4 white men. That's just anathema. I mean, in my business, if I find out that someone has shown up at a business pitch with 4 white men, they will hear from me. It's not even just a question of my moral commitment to diversity, it's just bad business. And for those people who may not particularly care about their personal moral commitment to diversity, the business case is such that you have to bring diverse people up the ranks. And the next example I'll give you is my last trial, which was a 10b-5 trial in federal court. I was telling Tricia at breakfast this morning, I was the first year trial lawyer. I had 2 male shareholders working with me and 1 woman associate. The other side of the aisle, there were 4 white men and 1 female paralegal that spent 2.5 weeks running around, looking in boxes, trying to hand them documents, being told, no, I told you that wasn't the right thing. I mean, it was such a joke that by the second week, I had made friends with her, and I'd go, oh, there, aren't they so unreasonable? And of course, keep in mind, the jury is 6 women, 2 men. So I did get a defense verdict, I'm happy to say, and I can't tell you that the gender diversity of our team, I don't know what kind of an impact it makes, but you cannot show up with diverse juries without having diverse lawyers. You can't. Again, business case. Your client will not tolerate it. I got a call from a major pharma company this week who wanted to interview me and one of my female partners who's also a trial lawyer. They wanted an all-female team. Why? Because the plaintiff was a very well-known woman. These kind of sensitivities are something that clients are looking at from a business perspective. So again, it's just one more reason why, aside from whatever institutional impediments there are, the business case today is that you must have diversity in your leadership ranks. And so for all of you, I am quite hopeful that that 18% number is going to increase significantly over the next 10 to 15 years. By the time you're in a position to be considered for equity partnership, these numbers are going to be much more based on a meritocracy and a recognition that we have to find top-notch women. I mean, we're all fighting over it. One of the reasons that those numbers, I also think, are somewhat deflated is because there's a tremendous amount of lateral movement in the marketplace today. People with business are much more apt to go across the street and change law firms because somebody's going to offer them more money. Women are much less likely to do that. Women, if they find a hospitable environment, they're doing well, they're being well compensated, the idea that they're going to leave that and go across the street for an extra $100,000 a year does not happen. It just doesn't. And so we, as a law firm, it's part of our expansion model, that we hire a tremendous amount of laterals. It is very hard for us to keep our numbers the same because it is so much easier to find male laterals out there than women. So what we've done is we've asked our women senior lawyers, go find people like yourselves. Convince them that this is a hospitable environment. And that goes to the last point I'll make, which is women in leadership positions. Women in leadership positions matter. And the example I gave is when I first started my first leadership position in a law firm was as the head of our Miami litigation group. It was 25 people. When I came in to that position, we had 20% women. When I left 6-7 years later, we had 50% women. I never once said we need to hire more women. When I look back at the numbers, I said, how did this happen? I never told anybody that this was my goal. It happens unconsciously. It happens because when you have a woman in leadership, people are more likely to want to bring women to my attention as a leader. People are more likely to evaluate women differently because they're accustomed to dealing with a woman in leadership. And women are more likely to be attracted to the environment because they say, well, it must be a hospitable environment. You've got a woman running the show. So again, another reason why I'm quite hopeful that these numbers will continue to increase.
So I'm hopeful too, but I'm not perhaps as optimistic as Hilarie is. And I want to suggest a couple of other kinds of things that are factual problems that we have to deal with and challenges in trying to explain why that curve seems to have such a started like this and seems to be so slow at the other end. I think it makes a difference. You have to make, if you're going to have children, you have to think about when in the cycle of your career you're going to have children. And there's no doubt that having a child for a woman is a different kind of event from having a child for a man. And one is, it's a physical condition, and you're pregnant for nine months, and you have a medical procedure, as it were, to give birth. And so there's it takes more time, and it's a different physiological event for a woman. And then you have to figure out sort of where it's going to happen. And there are a couple of different kinds of models, and I think it makes a difference within the cycle. So if you're going to be in big law, you go through this long period of doing the work before you're going to be considered for partner. And so there are two kinds of optimal times to think about having children. One is to front load your children, which is what I did. I had my first child 2 months after graduating from law school. I took the bar, and she was going like this, and I was going like this. And so I always had a young child in my career. And there are a lot of people of my generation and earlier who have become successful women who did that. Certainly Justice O'Connor did, certainly Justice Ginsburg did. If they had children, they sort of got started on a kind of a slower track almost, but they had the children as sort of parts of the picture as they were going forward and lived their careers with the children, adjusting for the children as they needed to. The other model that has probably been very successful for people is one like a daughter of mine has. She went up through the tracks at Allen and Overy in London and then had her first child at age 45. And now she's sort of stepping back and really enjoying her child. But there was, again, you can do it where during this period where you're really working the hardest you're going to work to make the leap to be a partner or to be a tenured professor, that you don't have the child when you have it later. It's a strategic choice about when to do it if you're going to have a child, and do you do it in the middle and do you disrupt your march, whatever that march is. But it's very complicated. There's been some empirical work done, but it's very hard to really know how to sort of massage the data you get and how to deal with it. But it seemed to me that I've never regretted that I did it early, that it made it easier for me to be where I am now, and my children are grown, and I don't have to worry about how many hours a week I work, and I don't have those kinds of issues. The second thing that, and that problem isn't going to go away, and I do think it affects, that fact isn't going to go away, and I do think it affects how many people are going to be at these top levels.
The women who work for me aren't quite so thoughtful. They just have them.
They just have them. Well, that's true. It's true for women who work for me, but I give them all this time off. But in a lot of worlds, you don't have the option of having somebody who's going to give them time off. And even the time off is disruptive to your march along. If you've got a scholarly agenda, I mean, you're not really doing your best scholarship when you're nursing a baby and not getting any sleep. I mean, it just isn't really geared for that. The second sort of lifestyle question happens to be a function of what sort of economic situation you're in. And people who find their economic partner early are better able to make decisions, or it's easier to make decisions to not push as hard to make money. If you're on your own, you don't have an economic partner, then it's whatever you're making that is that's what you're making and that's what you need, and so you need to be working to do it. You don't have any options. If you find your economic partner later in life and you're both at a stage where your economic situation is quite good and you put it together, then you also have more options in terms of what you do. And so I think, again, that's a factor. I don't know quite how to parse it out. I don't know how to parse it out, but I think it's not unrelated to some of the challenges that we're finding, particularly in a world like Hilarie lives in, where your economic circumstances are very good, but they're very much related to your performance and very much related to how much actual hours you're spending doing billable work. In the law world, in the legal academic world, your success is much more a function of just how much you publish and the quality of how you publish, and it doesn't. And the top professor and the bottom professor, maybe there's $100,000 difference between them. It's not a big. It's a very small number, really. And I'm sure, and we'd be really delighted to hear your thoughts about what some of the other factors are that we should be at least thinking about as we sort of try to explain this problem. David, hello.
So I want you to hear from the students, but just a quick thing, and I'm not sure, Derek, you mentioned this. I'm sorry I had to come in late. I'm David Wilkins. I'm the director of the program on the legal profession. Actually, we're the center on the legal profession. I should say we got a promotion. But I hope all of the Harvard students here know we did a major study on Harvard Law School graduates, a career study on graduates, in which we looked quite specifically at these gender issues. It's called the Women and Men of Harvard Law School. We looked at the classes of 75, 85, 95, and 2000. And you can download it for free on our website. I really recommend you looking at it because a lot of the things Trish just said, we have a lot of empirical support for. So There is a relationship between the number of children that Harvard Law School graduates have and their likelihood to be in the full-time workforce, and that's very different for women and men. The implications for your working life, for having a child, are very different for women and men. The perceptions of hours worked are very different for women and men, even though women are working, roughly speaking, the same or greater numbers of hours. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I don't want it to be, depressing in the sense that there are lots of success stories out there too, and I think that's why you should really talk to these amazing women who have been successful at the very tops of their professions. But you should also kind of know what the lay of the land is and where the landmines are, even for women as talented and as successful and as advantaged as all of you are, which is, you've come to Harvard Law School, you were obviously terrific before we got you, and we've given you whatever boost we can from being here. So with that, I'll just say it's on. If you just go to our website, it's easy, and if anybody from the center here can help you find it. But I think it's a great resource for students.
Well, David, I think part of that goes to having a plan. I mean, you may not know when you're going to meet your partner, and you're not going to know necessarily when you're going to be in a position to get pregnant or to want children or to have children. All of those factors, unfortunately, we don't control them all. But I do think it's even more important for women than men to have a game plan. I mean, we're all very goal-oriented. And there is a tendency to feel sort of like you've arrived, particularly when you make partner. Great, this goal that you've spent all these years trying to achieve, you're now a partner, wonderful, now I'm going to sit back and life is going to happen. And that does not work that way. Becoming a partner is just one more step on the ladder. Now the question is, do you want to become a practice group leader? Do you want to become a business generator? I mean, becoming a quality lawyer is first and foremost the most important thing you can do in any law firm. But at that point, you have choices to make. Should I be spending my time working on the recruiting committee? Or is that sort of one of these soft things that I'm not really going to get credit for? And the guy down the hall is busy taking clients to lunch in the hopes of developing long-term relationships that will benefit him when it comes to business originating. All of your decisions have to be thoughtful. When I decided that I wanted to go into firm leadership and management in some way, I went to my CEO and I said, I've been here 10 years. I think I really have something to contribute. Would you consider me as the next chair of the litigation practice group? And he was very receptive. He was very nice. We had a nice conversation. And I left, and I didn't hear anything from him again. And there was a thought in my mind that it was sort of like, there, little girl, that's very nice of you. Don't call us, we'll call you. This was Caesar. I started as a summer associate. That's what I thought he thought of me as, this young whippersnapper coming out of law school. And a year later, I had the same conversation. And I got a similar reaction. I went back a third time. Now, the difference between the second time I made the request and the third time I made the request was I had been very involved in United Way. Somebody called me up when I was a third year, said, would you like to volunteer to help us give the money away? I said, well, that sounds like fun. It's like writing the checks, not collecting the money. I volunteered. I enjoyed it tremendously. I was eventually asked to be on the board. At some point, the bank president, who was supposed to become the next board chair, got transferred, and they came to me and they said, we've never had a woman chair, would you like to do it? I said, great. So between the second and the third time that I made this request to get into firm leadership, suddenly, instead of this young summer associate who'd sort of worked her way up, I was now chairing a board with all the major CEOs in town around the table. And I think my CEO thought, he had to think of me differently because I was being perceived in the community differently. And shortly thereafter, he gave me the opportunity to take on this leadership role, and I worked my ass off. I did really well, and I then started, moving on up. But again, that was a conscious choice And looking back on it, I did not realize that branding myself in the community as a leader was going to help me within the law firm. Because, again, you want to be merit-based, you want these judgments to be merit-based. They could not deny the fact that I was chairing a board with all these CEOs on it. It was relatively easy to say, oh yeah, she's nice, she's a good lawyer, but you know, there are all these other guys, they've been here 10 years longer than her.
So who
So-
has a question? Yes.
So I'm actually sorry, I have to run to class soon, and I would love to chat with you about all the challenges I think women face in the legal profession. But I'm just interested in how you deal with, you know, more subtle ideologies of patriarchy that are obviously so entrenched in how we deal with women. I mean, maybe women, obviously it's a bigger physiological burden on women if they decide to have a child, but we obviously frame it as women as the primary caregiver. Maybe women have to deal with these problems because that's how society tells us we have to care about raising children and men don't. Can you imagine sitting in a room filled with men and hearing that the two biggest problems that they need to think about facing in their legal profession is when to have a child and when to plan or how to plan, you know, your economic partner? That would never ever happen. And how do you deal with constantly reiterating, and this happens at my firm because, like you stated when I was interviewing, all these firms were so quick to tell me, you can do 80-20%, you can have a family, don't worry, you can still maybe even become a partner one day, even though you're a woman, even though you probably are gonna have a family. And how do you deal with the isolation that then happens to women who either don't wanna have a family, can't have a family, queer women like myself who their partner might be the one who's gonna bear the children? I mean, I would love to come and hear about those types of issues that women face rather than, again, framing the issue as how do women deal with having a family and trying to succeed in life. I mean, when are we gonna break down those so obviously entrenched norms? How can you possibly do that when even the women who are supposed to be, you know, changing these issues are reiterating those concepts?
Well, I think the question is more tendentious than you intend it to be, because there are two sets of kinds of problems that you're looking at. One is we have to figure out how to break that barrier. That's the first, and we have to do that. And we have to figure out, that becomes a pragmatic question. How are we going to do it? And if we're trying to analyze sort of what are some of the problems, there are a lot of problems, and you have certainly articulated some of them. But it's going to be a whole lot easier if we can break that barrier initially to have those problems more articulated and to go away. And so there are really two sets of steps in my view. One is sort of the practical step and just sort of explaining, how has this happened? Why are we where we are? And the other is the normative question, which are some of the ones that you're asking, which are how can we improve the situation once it's there, and what are the social and structural issues, the conceptual kinds of issues that we're talking about. And so, as I say, one is a practical problem and the other is a normative problem, and how we discuss things. And at least my experience is that those discussions are much more easily and productively had in a context where you have more women than they are when the women are feeling isolated. And so there's that kind of an answer. And so if within a school, for example, it's a whole lot easier to have those conversations because we have a better parity. We have a better parity particularly among the younger women. We have a huge gay population among my faculty, for example. I'm proud to say that I'm the only law dean in America who, when looking at my sections, who was teaching in the first year section where you try to have some balance, I looked at a section, I said, I can't have this section. Every faculty member is a gay Latina. I said, what a great problem to have. I mean, this is like the best problem I ever had as a dean. But that meant that we were in a position that we actually had done that with our faculty. And so you could only then start to have those kinds of conversations after you had actually fixed those numbers. And so we're focusing here more on what's the explanation for some of these numbers rather than some of the normative questions.
Yeah, but I guess, and again, I'm sorry actually, but I'll leave you with, as I said, when looking at these statistics, what if the answer to the pragmatic problem is to first fix, especially in a law firm culture, those normative questions of if we're framing the issue as women must be the primary caregiver, how are we possibly going to fix the problem of, we obviously have gotten a lot better in just getting women into law school, getting women into law firms, getting women to be attorneys. If we're framing it as women must be the primary caregiver.
No, don't think for a second that we are suggesting that women have to be the primary caregiver.
No.
But what we are saying is that if you choose to have children, you need to have a game plan.
Sure.
How it's going to fit within your work life.
But as
whatever that looks
a
like.
talk on women in the legal profession as a very general issue, I just, would have liked to hear something other than what I constantly hear from the law school, from my law firm, about simply my reproductive capacity. So I'll just leave you with that, but thank you.
Anyone else?
Sure.
So we covered a little bit about the percentages for law firms, in-house counsel, and academia, and I was wondering if you knew what the percentages were for like government lawyers.
Actually, we do.
Yeah, you probably know. David probably knows it off the top of his head.
So the numbers are more equal, as well as the pay is more equal. I haven't talked about money yet.
Right.
We could do income studies, particularly at the federal government level. But again, go all the way. The higher you go up, the more unequal it comes. Let's look at the U.S. Senate. Let's look at the President of the United States, etc. I think, I think that there's very important points that were being made by the student who had to leave, and it's just how to think about understanding what the empirical reality is, and then trying to understand what's the way to intervene in this process. And I think you do have to think about these things as connected, and part of it is changing people's attitudes and changing people's expectations. Part of it is changing, their expectations about what is leadership. That's a little bit about what they've been talking about today. Part of it is changing expectations about who is supposed to be responsible for what in our society and who bears the burden of that. I think empirically, there's no question women bear the burden of it, but that doesn't mean it should be taken as a given. And I don't think either Hilarie or Trish would say that. So, but the federal government, the more structured equality you have, the more likely you're going to produce equality in the outcome. The more subjective determinations you have, which in all of the worlds they're talking about are incredibly subjective, what you value, how you value it, how it's perceived, who speaks and what it's worth, the more you're likely to run into now the kind of unconscious biases, understanding of gender stereotypes, all the other kinds of things that I think the other question and many of you are.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if we should take into account sexual harassment as a possible factor that explains why we don't have women in the top positions of big law firms. Because I come from Colombia, from Universidad de los Andes, and they were doing some research. They were interviewing young women associates, and they said that when they were trying to bring new business into the firm, they didn't feel comfortable interacting with men clients because sometimes they were just asking them out and all that. So I don't know if that is the case here.
I think there are some women who find that it is a hindrance in business generation because so much of it is socializing with men that they have a higher discomfort level. I work with some of the women in my firm and try and come up with alternatives. Simple things like, all firms have tickets to the football games, the basketball games, whatever, and oftentimes women will say, well, I don't feel comfortable asking a male client to go. And so my solution is offer them 2 tickets. Would you and your partner, would you and a colleague like to join me at whatever? There are very practical solutions to some of those issues. But again, it's one of these things that you have to work through. You have to think it through. I don't want this person to get the wrong impression as to the reason I'm inviting them to socialize with me. But there are practical answers to how you can minimize the concern. You go in a group so that it's not a one-on-one experience. I don't think there is a lot of sexual harassment within the law firms. I think that's very unusual nowadays. People are much more conscious of inappropriate behavior. So it's a rarity that I hear that kind of interaction within the law firm. But sometimes with outside clients, yes. And sometimes there are clients who will say, I don't feel comfortable with the woman leading my team. And the question is, how does the law firm react to that? Hopefully the law firm says, oh, that's too bad because she's the best lawyer for the job. I'm sure you can find another law firm that'll find somebody else.
And it's much harder, the sexual harassment questions are much harder for young women to deal with. I mean, I find as I get older, it's a lot easier. But not surprisingly, but when you're a young woman, it's a real issue. And you do have to sort of think your way through it. And I cannot reiterate enough what David said about actually going and reading the stuff. Reading the report, going in with your eyes open, being reflective and thinking about it is really important. Helping you identify where the issues are going to be so that you can come up with the kinds of strategies and strategic behavioral choices that you make when you're informed. It's really a surprise when things happen to you that you weren't prepared for. So my story about the faculty member who told me not to take, too bad I was a tax lawyer, I was stunned. I was not as prepared for sort of reacting to that as I should have been. And so I think it behooves everybody, and it behooves the men too, because if you do that, you become much more self-conscious and thoughtful and react appropriately. Yes, ma'am.
So I actually have a question on that point. When you were telling that story and mentioned that we can't imagine that happening today, I almost wonder if that itself might be a problem because you were able to, once your colleague came to you and voiced his concern, however ill-founded it was, like you were able to head that off. But today I feel like people might be harboring those thoughts and you have no, firms may say, that's great, you're gonna have a kid, like we're gonna make all these accommodations for you, and then sort of behind the scenes, nobody's gonna voice their silent concerns about it, you sort of get mommy tracked, or you wouldn't have had the chance to respond, call up the head of the committee. So I just wonder, I don't know if there's a question at the end of this, but how do we deal with the fact that a lot of that's being pushed underground almost?
Well, the one thing I would say is, much to Tricia's point, keep your eyes open. I mean, when you go out and interview with law firms, you're Harvard law students, you can have lots of options. You should be looking around the firms you're interviewing with and saying, where are the women? Making sure you interview with the women who've had children. How did your firm handle it? Did you feel like you were mommy tracked when you came back? Are there women in leadership positions with children? Did you ever make a partner of a woman on maternity leave? What's happened to the women who chose to take part-time? Did they end up making partner? Or was it one, a side track to the mommy track? I mean, there is lots of institutional history at the firms you're going to be looking at, and you should be asking those questions because there's no better evidence of what's really going on in a firm than, one of the members of my executive committee has 4 children, and she has an international practice. Many people would say, that's insane. She's able to do it. She's been incredibly successful. She's taken multiple maternity leaves, multiple part-time. So you want to see that success story. And you don't want to see it, I always say, we'll know we've arrived when the mediocre women can do as well as the mediocre men. It's not just a question of how well the superstars do. You want to know how well just the hardworking, really bright women lawyers do. You shouldn't have to be willing to bill 3,000 hours a year to be able to have a child and be successful. So it's up to you to ask questions and to really observe the women in the law firms that you're talking to see what do their careers look like, what have their career trajectories been.
To that point, would you agree that as more women assume leadership roles in law firms for which many of these young folks are aspiring to join, that it's critically important to have and seek out mentoring opportunities with those women who have been successful? And in many cases, rather than try to differentiate yourself, learn from their own experiences within those firms?
Mentors are wonderful. I had a male mentor. I learned as much from him as I think I could have learned from a woman mentor. That being the case, women need to connect with other women in their law firms, whether it's a formal mentor relationship or just going into a woman shareholder and say, I'd love to take you out to lunch. Everybody loves to talk about themselves. It's just human nature. If you say, I'd love to hear how you reached this level in your career, I'm so curious, I would love to emulate your success, they'll sit and talk to you. And so take advantage of every opportunity to figure out how they navigated these issues. Everybody's got a different approach, but there are lots of different approaches that can be successful. And you just need to figure out what works for you.
Can I just emphasize one thing Hilarie said, and then I'm going to say that about public service and government? This is really, I mean, that story you told about being on the United Way, and you could have told it about being on a community service board or being in an organization. People don't think enough about the opportunities you could get to have leadership in public service, and that actually can also help you build your career. I wrote an overly long article called Doing Good by Doing Well. I mean, doing well by doing good by doing, no, doing
Good
well
by doing good, I
respect. Remember the thing. But it's all about how, particularly for women, for minority lawyers, this is critical. Anyway, please, quick.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to raise the question related to Asian women who similarly were fit to this stereotype of being not aggressive, like more obedient, and like take academia, for example, like in Harvard Law School and Yale Law School, there are only 3 Asian American women who all study family law or ethnic conflicts, who married or previously married to or related to other law professors. So how will you describe the situations for Asian women instead of your suggestions?
So my daughter-in-law is Chinese, and my son, who's Caucasian, is a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing.
Oh, I graduated.
Okay, so I guess that's why Hilarie's looking at me with that particular question, and I think it's been very interesting for me to get to know my daughter-in-law and watch her dealing with these problems or issues. And it's been very interesting for me to watch my son be in a culture which is so different from his own culture, in a university kind of culture. And I think that it turns out, really, first of all, that cultural differences are distinctively interesting and varied, depending on the culture. And it's a mistake for any of us to assume or to think that the worlds that we live in and the issues that we're dealing with in our respective worlds are universal, because they're not. They really do make a difference. And so, we've been here talking about basically women focusing, and mostly focusing on majority women in the United States kind of context. There are very different questions to ask about minorities, and there are differences between the minorities and different issues, I think is really interesting. And then there are issues, and you're talking about being from Los Andes in Bogota, means there are also, we have many actually Colombian students in our law school, and the differences of language become very importantly different. And so I think it's important to get yourself informed as much as you can about the empirical work and the experience that's been done for the particular group that you're a member of with respect to this, and the context that you're going into. I mean, just watching in the reverse, my son, as the only blonde, blue-eyed professor in the economics department at Tsinghua, him dealing in that situation is a sort of a reverse of you're dealing with the situation here. And there's similarities, but there are differences. And so instead of reflecting with a real answer, I just think it really does require reflectiveness. I mean, reflectiveness is always a good thing. Getting data is always a good thing. And taking the data and figuring out what you can do with it and how you can think about it is always a good thing. So that's my answer.
Unfortunately, it's 5 after 1. It's a shame we can't devote more time to this very important topic, but please give a round of applause to Hilarie, Patricia.